completed the 100-meter dash. Our next event will be the 400. This is, I think, maybe a difficult text for us. I think that there are different reasons for that, but for the most part, I think this is a difficult text because the Sabbath is a commandment that might be the most convicting out of any of the other commandments that we are given. And not because we see breaking this commandment as some terrible and heinous crime. I mean, let's be honest, if we're going to weigh them, murder and breaking the Sabbath don't quite seem to be on the same level often. We certainly don't persecute them the same way. But usually, I would wager that no other commandment that is given in the Ten Commandments is seen as more antiquated or is seen as something that can be so easily disregarded as a time of Sabbath rest and Sabbath holiness. See, our gospel from Mark reminds us that there was a time when the Sabbath was very, very highly regulated, when there were people who were watching out at what you were doing and making sure you were not breaking any Sabbath laws. But we actually don't have to go back to first century Palestine to remember that. See, if you could just go back even a few decades, particularly a few hundred years, we would see a very similar Sabbath tradition here in the United States, because there was a time when blue laws would restrict many activities on Sundays. Now, here in the great state of Pennsylvania, we still have one blue law on the book. Does anyone remember what we cannot do on a Sunday? What's that? No? There's one that's very, very big. Well, actually, I don't know. I haven't tried that one, so maybe it is. I'm new here. But I know there's one that I saw particularly. You cannot buy a car on a Sunday. It is a law, I believe, in about 7 different states. No change for me. You couldn't do it in Illinois either, but it's the best time to go looking because no one can hassle you on the lot. But there are many reasons that people suggest that these kind of laws came to be. Some believe it was to encourage church attendance. I mean, if people can literally do nothing else on a Sunday morning, well, you might as well come to church. But I mean, if that was the only thing going on, if it was only to get people in the pews, then it would seem a little, I don't know, self-serving slightly. But there were other reasons that people point to as well. See, often it was trade unions and other social agencies that would advocate alongside the church for blue laws. Why? Because in the days before an established 40-hour work week, before there were weekends as a thing, it guaranteed workers of affected industries a much-needed day of rest. If you're a car salesman who will be put to work 7 days a week, if there's a law that says you can't work Sunday, you just got a day off. Now, some might think, but that's not the point. The Sabbath is meant to be a holy day. But I think to really get to the heart of Sabbath keeping, we need to go back to our first reading, back in Deuteronomy chapter 5, when Moses receives the Ten Commandments. So I want you to listen one more time, because there's a very important aspect of this. We remember the beginning part. Observe the Sabbath day and keep it holy as the Lord your God commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th is a Sabbath to the Lord your God, and you shall not do any work. Now note, in most of the copies of the Ten Commandments that we read, that's about all it says, which is something to keep in mind, because Deuteronomy makes it very clear why this is so important. You, or your son, or your daughter, or your male or female slave, or your ox, or your donkey, or any of your livestock, or the resident alien in your towns, so that your male and female slave may rest just as well as you. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. Note, it's not just for ourselves. Why do we keep the Sabbath? For all of those who might be affected by it. See, I hope you can hear in this the echoes of Jesus in our gospel reading from Mark. Remember that the Sabbath was made for mankind, not mankind for the Sabbath. This was not a rule which we were born under, but a gift that was given to us. See, for the Israelite people, a people who had just literally escaped from slavery, who observed it as a time in slavery where they had no control. They could not exercise which days they would work and which days they would take off. If they were still breathing, they were still working. And so when they could not control their own schedules, when they could not control their own lives, they were forced to not keep a Sabbath. And so when God ushers and gives the 10 Commandments to his people, they are not 10 commandments that are given specifically only for them to lead a better life. But in this instance, I very much believe that this commandment is given so that we and them would not become the oppressors who they once were under. That in keeping a Sabbath day holy, they would remember that as they were once slaves, so their slaves might also need a time of rest. Not only them, but the animals that they kept. I wonder, have you ever thought as you look down at your dog or your cat? Well, when I look down at my cat, I go, I hope you're having a great Sabbath every day of the week. But your animals, if anyone keeps horses, if anyone keeps cows, livestock, to consider that the Sabbath is a holy and set-aside day for them as well as for us. If we keep the fields, if we grow, that it is just as much a commandment to keep the soil, to give it a time of rest, as it is for humanity. See, the Sabbath was a command meant to give life, to keep the people who observed it from exercising complete control over their world, not only of their own schedules or of their own lives, but of the lives of those that they commanded, the animals they kept, and the very environment that they live in. See, the Sabbath was not only a law for rest, it was a law for justice, a guarantee that a time would be set aside to rest from the activities of production, and instead that time would be given to all as a time of reflection, as a time of peace, a time set apart. It ensured the Israelites would never become those slave masters they were once under. And so when we talk about it being a holy day, when we say Sunday is our holy day, we have to remember two things. One, when we read Sabbath in the Old Testament, that was from Friday to Saturday. We had a little bit of a shift there in the first century when Christianity started meeting on Sundays. But also, that when we talk about holiness, it means to take something and to set it apart. When we say holy in the English language, we think it is something that should be shining and glowing at all times, that God has blessed. But if we take it in the original Greek, something that is holy is something set aside, set on a pedestal, set up, often in honor of God, but most importantly, that it would be different from all of those things around it. So to keep this context in mind, I want to look at our gospel reading, but hold on to this element of justice, this element of something being set apart, as we talk about these stories of Jesus and Sabbath. But before we jump into there, just wanted to clarify one little thing. If you remember in our gospel readings for the last, who even knows how many weeks at this point, we have been in John pretty much since Easter time. And now we are jumping straight back to Mark. And we are in Mark chapter 2. And if we remember just a little what has happened so far in the book of Mark, chapter 1 focuses on John the Baptist as he is proclaiming that the Messiah is coming. We have Jesus' baptism and the beginning of his ministry. And as we get into Mark chapter 2, the very beginning bit deals with Jesus healing, with him casting out demons, and this crowd of people who begins to follow this guy who's doing all of these amazing things. It shows that his popularity was beginning to grow very rapidly. And then the gospel takes a shift as we get into the end of chapter 2. Suddenly, at every stage, the Pharisees, the keeper of the religious law, were keeping an eye on Jesus. They were making sure he wasn't doing anything that he shouldn't be doing. Why? Well, because he was getting pretty popular, and they weren't a huge fan of that. See, they were always raising a stink about something that he was doing, whether it was forgiving someone's sins, whether it was eating alongside tax collectors, or as our gospel text for today shows, breaking the rules of the Sabbath. And so our gospel talks about two stories. One, as the disciples are making their way through a field, and they are picking off pieces of grain and eating them on their way. And the second, through a miraculous healing of a man's crippled hand in the middle of the synagogue, in front of everyone who is gathered there, but doing it on the Sabbath, a day that was supposed to be set aside for rest. Now, when we talk about Sabbath in this culture, there are rules upon rules that regulate what you can do. I had a very long tangent as I was preparing this sermon, as I was looking at all the different kinds of light bulbs you can get for the Sabbath, because you can't turn on or off a light switch, because there is both a rule for creating fire and extinguishing fire. Makes me wonder if LED light bulbs changed this at all, but I couldn't find that answer yet. But, you know, they have sliders on them, so that instead of turning it off, all you do is cover it up, so you don't see the light, but you're not starting or turning off a fire. And so there are all of these rules: harvesting, going through and separating anything that you've harvested. Again, so many of these come from a place of justice, of rest for all of the world. But here we see this sticking point. And I want to focus in on this second story, what it means to obey the gospel in this context, because this, I believe, is a turning point in the Gospel of Mark. We are only 79 verses into the gospel, and here already we see the Pharisees and the Herodians are plotting to destroy Jesus. His ministry had just begun, and people are already getting ready to get rid of him. Now, I see this story as the definition of a terrible first call. I mean, just gets going and the council is already plotting to sack him. But I believe it also teaches a very powerful lesson about the Sabbath. See, Jesus calls this man with the crippled hand forward into the middle of the assembly and asks the people. Now, it doesn't specify, is he only talking to the Pharisees there? Everyone is listening, so I like to say that he is speaking to everyone. All of the people gathered, and he asks, which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill? But everyone there remains silent. They say nothing. And I wonder if that's not condemnation enough right there. See, not only for the teachers of law, but also for you and for me. See, can I tell you something? I think that the Sabbath has another purpose that we don't talk about as much. When we think about the purpose of a Sabbath, of a time set aside for worship, for rest, and for reflection, when we think about the purpose of this Sabbath, it becomes clear that, well, it is the commandment we care the least to keep. It also might be the one that we need the most. Because Sabbath rest opens us up to the possibility to act. When we had the children's sermon, I think I was speaking as much to y'all. It was one of those same things with Jesus. But when we don't rest, how do we feel? Anyone here not get a good night's sleep? I believe the words, someone woke up on the wrong side of the bed this morning, often applies in those situations. See, busyness and fatigue can keep us from hearing this gentle nudge of the Spirit. They can keep us from the obvious need of our neighbors. They can even keep us from recognizing the clear signs our own bodies are giving to us. And I think that that is of immense importance that we understand the only time, and I do mean the only time, and this was fascinating for me, I did not know this before, that Jesus is described as angry in all of the Gospels. The only time Jesus is clearly labeled as angry is right here. When he asks them, is it lawful to do good or to do evil on the Sabbath, and everyone can do nothing but remain silent? Think about that. Jesus makes a cord and flips tables in the temple, never says he's angry. But here, very clear in the text, Jesus is not having it. People, what is the point of the Sabbath? If it is to be controlled by rules and laws that keep us from doing anything, then you have missed the point. The goal of Sabbath is justice, that we would have rest, and in that rest find the time to reflect, so to act. See, anger in Jesus' voice when he asked them. This is a command to bring justice and peace, and it had been filled to the brim with laws that preoccupy the mind and overcome the spirit. Can you imagine what it would be like to walk into your Sabbath and say, all right, good thing today, I need to focus on the 67 different things I can't do at all. And what about these Pharisees? What does it mean that their Sabbath procedure is to walk around and make sure that no one else does anything? Does that sound like rest and reflection? No. The Sabbath was made for humankind. Think about that. What does it mean that God looked upon humanity and said, you need a time to rest. You need a time to reprioritize. You need a time to know what is truly important in your life. Because so often we don't. So often we look at the things that are going on in our life, those things that we have to do. We have to make more money. We have to go and do this thing. We have to participate in this and that. And our time of rest is overcome by a time of burden. Folks, Sabbath is an invitation to live life in a different way, to live our lives set apart from the rest of the world that will continue to go on as if one day out of the week is no different than any other. And there's a reason God made it law. Because we're terrible at it. We really are. Think about how often every day off we have gets filled up. And so time to sit, to reflect, to read Scripture, to spend time in prayer gets set to the side. Even to do good things. Jesus looks at the people around him and says, is it good? Is it lawful to do good or harm on the Sabbath? And silence. Do they not know? One would ask, how could it be bad to do good on the Sabbath? But here, Jesus looks at the man and in front of the assembly says, stretch out your hand. And I like to think of this as one of those wonderful defiant acts of Jesus. Those times when he's staring the Pharisees right in the eye as he says, just stretch your hand out there. Not even looking to see what would happen. There's a reason right after this they plotted to kill him. Because this is where Jesus took the law and he broke it open. It became less a set of rules about how to live our life and more an understanding of how to truly walk with justice and mercy and peace. And for some, they didn't understand it. But for us, for those who are gathered here, I pray that this is a story that reminds us not only of the importance of keeping a Sabbath, of having a time set aside to reflect and to act, but the entire purpose of what this law that we have came to do. It came to bring peace and love and justice to a world that needs it. And so may we follow Christ. May we not be silent when he asks, is it lawful to do good today? And instead, may we be about doing that good. Amen.